Night, a lonely train. A journey into the unknown. This is the story of a train that vanished. Not just the train itself, but everyone on board. Except one. It began simply enough. A group of friends excited for an adventure. They boarded a train, eager to reach their destination. Little did they know, they were embarking on a one-way trip into a nightmare, a journey to a place that doesn't exist. A station that's not on any map. This isn't a work of fiction, this is a true story, a chilling tale that has baffled investigators for decades. A mystery shrouded in fear and uncertainty. The story of the ghost train, and the station that never existed. Join us as we delve into the chilling events of that fateful night, unravel the clues and try to understand what happened to those lost souls. He stumbled out of the darkness, alone, confused, haunted by memories he couldn't understand. He was the only survivor, the sole witness to an unimaginable horror. But his mind held the key to unlocking the mystery. A mystery that began with a simple train journey. A journey that turned into a terrifying descent into the unknown. His name was David, and this is his story. A story of survival, a story of loss, a story of a mystery that continues to haunt us to this day. A story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about reality, about life, about death. Are you ready to face the truth? The year was 1955. The world was a different place, simpler perhaps, but not without its shadows. Our story begins on a crisp autumn evening. The Grand Central Station, a symphony of echoing footsteps and hushed farewells. Among the bustling crowd, a group of friends prepared to embark on their journey. David, the quiet observer, Emily, the life of the party, and Richard, the pragmatic one. Their laughter echoed through the grand hall, a stark contrast to the chilling events that would soon unfold. Their train, the Midnight Express, stood waiting, a behemoth of iron and steam, promising a comfortable journey to their destination. They found their cabin, settling in with a mix of anticipation and excitement. The train lurched forward, slowly gaining speed as it pulled away from the platform. The familiar cityscape began to fade, replaced by the blurry tapestry of the night. Inside their cabin, stories were shared, jokes exchanged, dreams whispered. They were oblivious, blissfully unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. Hours melted away. The rhythmic clatter of the train lulled the passengers into a sense of security. David gazed out the window, mesmerized by the passing scenery. Trees swayed in the night breeze, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The moon, a silver sliver in the inky sky, cast long, dancing shadows on the ground. He felt a shiver run down his spine, a fleeting moment of unease he couldn't quite place. The air in the cabin grew heavy, the cheerful banter fading into an uncomfortable silence. Emily, usually the epitome of joy, sat staring at her reflection in the window. Her face, usually bright and animated, was now pale and drawn. Richard, ever the pragmatist, busied himself with a deck of cards, attempting to break the growing tension. But even his usually steady hands couldn't hide the tremor that had crept into them. Something was wrong. They could all feel it. The train, once a symbol of their journey, was now a metal cage hurtling them towards the unknown. A figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the carriage. The conductor, his face obscured by the dim light, moved with an unsettling stillness. He checked their tickets, his voice a low, raspy whisper that seemed to cling to the air. There was something strange about his demeanor, a coldness in his eyes that sent a chill down David's spine. As the conductor moved on, David noticed something peculiar. The scenery outside the window had changed. Gone were the rolling hills and distant lights of civilization. They were now surrounded by a dense, ancient forest. The trees pressed close to the tracks, their branches twisting and contorting like grotesque limbs reaching out to grab them. The air outside was thick with fog, a swirling, ethereal mist that seemed to pulse with an unnatural life of its own. Emily pulled out a map, her finger tracing their supposed route. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice trembling. We should have passed through Willow Creek hours ago. This isn't the way. Richard, ever the voice of reason, tried to calm her fears. There must be a logical explanation, he said, his voice strained. Perhaps there's been a delay, a change in schedule. But deep down even he couldn't shake off the growing sense of unease. David studied the map, his blood ran cold. Where they were there should have been towns, rivers, landmarks. Instead, there was nothing, just a blank space, an empty void. It was as if the place outside their window didn't exist. They were lost, hopelessly lost. And in that moment, as the train rattled on through the impenetrable darkness, they knew. This was no ordinary journey. They had stumbled onto something sinister, something beyond explanation, and there was no turning back. The train screeched to a halt, a bone-jarring stop that jolted the passengers awake from their uneasy slumber. David looked out the window, his heart sinking like a stone in his chest. They had arrived at a station, but it was like no station he had ever seen before. The platform was deserted. The air, thick with fog, hung heavy with the stench of damp earth and something else, something unsettlingly sweet and metallic. The station building itself was a dilapidated Victorian structure. Its windows were dark, like empty eyes staring out into the night. A rusty sign, barely clinging to the rotting wood, bore the faintest outline of a name. David strained his eyes, trying to decipher the faded letters. But the name meant nothing to him. It was a name he had never heard before, a name that sent shivers down his spine. This place was not on any map. It didn't exist. David, Emily, and Richard stepped out onto the platform, joining a handful of other passengers who seemed equally bewildered. They looked around, their faces pale in the eerie glow of the gaslights that flickered sporadically, casting long, dancing shadows. An unsettling silence hung in the air, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam from the train engine. There were no station staff, no porters, no other souls in sight. It was as if the station itself had been abandoned to the fog and the shadows. A low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet as the train began to move. Panic surged through the small group of passengers as they realized what was happening. The train, their only link to the world they knew, was leaving. They shouted, waved their arms, desperate to get the attention of someone, anyone on board. But it was no use. The train chugged away into the fog, its red taillights disappearing like fading embers in the darkness. They were alone, stranded in a place that shouldn't exist. With a growing sense of dread, David, Emily, and Richard decided to explore their surroundings. They followed a narrow cobblestone street leading away from the station. The fog clung to them like a shroud, muffling all sound, amplifying their sense of isolation. The buildings lining the street were old, their facades crumbling, their windows dark and empty. There were no lights, no signs of life, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on them, suffocating them. They passed a bakery, its window displaying a stale loaf of bread that looked as if it had been there for decades. A butcher shop, its hooks empty, the air thick with the phantom stench of decay. A toy store, its shelves bare except for a single dusty doll with vacant eyes that seemed to follow their every move. It was like walking through a ghost town, a place frozen in time, a place where the living dared not tread. They reached a crossroads, the fog swirling around them, disorienting them. There were no signs, no landmarks, nothing familiar to guide them. They were utterly lost in a labyrinth of deserted streets and crumbling buildings. Panic welled up inside David. He felt a cold hand grip his heart, squeezing the air from his lungs. Something was terribly wrong. This place was not right. It felt evil. As they stood there, lost and afraid, David noticed something that made his blood run cold. He looked back down the street they had just come from. The train tracks, their only way in or out of this forsaken place, were gone. They simply ended, disappearing into the fog as if they had never existed at all. They were trapped, imprisoned in a town that was not on any map, a station that never existed. And as the fog closed in around them, swallowing them whole, they knew that something evil was watching, waiting, hunting. The fog pressed in, a suffocating blanket of white that swallowed the sound of their footsteps and stole their breath. David, Emily, and Richard huddled together, their fear a palpable presence in the chilling air. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the frantic beating of their own hearts. They were lost in a maze of cobblestone streets, each turn leading them deeper into the heart of the abandoned town. The buildings watched them with empty eyes, their windows like dark, vacant sockets. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, taking on menacing shapes in the swirling fog. David felt a chill crawl down his spine, a primal instinct screaming at him to run, to escape this place while he still could. But where could they run? They were trapped, caught in a web spun from shadows and fear. A sound, faint and ethereal, drifted through the fog, sending shivers down their spines. It was a whisper, barely audible yet charged with an unsettling malice. Emily gripped David's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. David strained his ears, listening intently. The whisper came again, closer this time, slithering through the fog like a serpent. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He couldn't make out any words, just a low, guttural murmur that sent chills down his spine. It was the sound of madness, of something ancient and evil, toying with them. Through the swirling fog, a shape loomed, a tall, imposing structure, its silhouette stark against the swirling gray. As they drew closer, they recognized it for what it was, a clock tower, its Gothic architecture a haunting reminder of a bygone era. But there was something wrong with the clock. Its face was shrouded in fog, the hands frozen in time, eternally marking the stroke of midnight. At the base of the tower, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. A faint, eerie light emanated from within, casting long, dancing shadows on the cobblestone street. It beckoned them, promising answers, a refuge from the oppressive fog. But something about it felt wrong, like a spider's web, beautiful yet deadly, luring unsuspecting prey. Despite their better judgment, curiosity, and a desperate hope for escape, drew them toward the open door. Each step felt heavier than the last, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the threshold, the whispers in the fog intensified, swirling around them like a vortex of madness. David paused, a sense of foreboding washing over him. He turned back to look at the town, now barely visible through the thick fog. It was then he realized the horrifying truth. They were not alone. Silently watching from the fog-choked streets, hidden within the shadows of the abandoned buildings, were figures. Dozens of them. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, their forms shifting and swirling like the fog itself. They had been led here, herded like cattle to slaughter, and the clock tower, their supposed sanctuary, was nothing more than a cage. There would be no escape. David tried to warn Emily and Richard, but it was too late. The figures in the fog moved with unnatural speed, their forms blurring, their whispers transforming into a deafening cacophony. Driven by fear and a desperate hope for refuge, the trio stumbled across the threshold and into the abyss. The door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. The sound of Emily's scream was cut short, swallowed by the suffocating silence. David fumbled for his lighter, the familiar click and hiss of the flame a small comfort in the overwhelming darkness. The air hung heavy and cold, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something else, something metallic and strangely sweet. He could hear Emily and Richard's frantic breaths echoing around them, but he couldn't see them. The darkness was absolute, impenetrable, a living presence that pressed in on them from all sides. Guided by instinct, David reached out, his hand brushing against a cold, damp stone wall. He moved slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, the lighter held out in front of him like a beacon against the consuming darkness. He could hear a faint, rhythmic ticking echoing through the tower, each beat a hammer blow against his sanity. It was the sound of the clock, but it sounded different now, closer, more alive. A glimmer of light caught David's eye. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat. There, directly in front of him, was a narrow spiral staircase leading upwards into the darkness. The steps were made of ancient stone, worn smooth with age, and they spiraled upwards like the inside of a giant petrified snail shell. It was the only way out, the only escape from the suffocating darkness. "Emily? Richard?" David's voice echoed through the empty space, swallowed by the darkness. There was no answer. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. He had lost sight of them the moment they crossed the threshold. He was alone. Taking a deep breath, David started up the spiral staircase. The steps were narrow and treacherous, the air growing colder with each upward turn. He gripped the rusted iron railing, his knuckles white with the strain, his eyes constantly searching the darkness for any sign of his friends. The ticking of the clock grew louder, each beat a heavy thud against his eardrums. It felt like the tower itself was alive, its heart beating in time with his own growing terror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David emerged from the suffocating darkness into a large, circular chamber at the top of the tower. The air here was thin and cold, and the only light came from a single narrow window that offered a glimpse of the fog-shrouded town below. In the center of the chamber stood the clock face, its massive gears turning slowly, relentlessly, their rhythmic movements hypnotically mesmerizing. As David stumbled towards the window, a sound cut through the silence. It was a long, low whistle, mournful and haunting, echoing through the deserted station below. David's blood ran cold. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the train. But how? David awoke in a hospital bed, disoriented and drenched in a cold sweat. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The sterile white walls, the hum of medical equipment, the concerned faces of strangers peering down at him. It was a stark contrast to the nightmare he had just escaped. Or had he? The line between dream and reality blurred, the lingering scent of fog and decay clinging to his senses. He could still hear the clock's haunting tick, the chilling whispers in the fog, the mournful wail of the train whistle fading into the distance. He remembered the terrifying climb up the clock tower, the deafening silence as he searched for his friends, the crushing realization that he was alone. He remembered reaching the top, the train whistle piercing the night, and then nothing. A gaping hole in his memory, a void where the most terrifying moments of his life should have been. He called out for Emily and Richard, his voice hoarse and desperate, but only the concerned murmurs of the doctors greeted him. Their faces, etched with a professional sympathy that did little to soothe his fear, confirmed his worst nightmare. He was the only one who had returned. The official explanation was simple, almost insultingly so. David had wandered off, become disoriented, perhaps suffered a head injury. He was found days later, delirious and dehydrated, near an abandoned rail yard miles from where the Midnight Express had made its scheduled stop. The station, the fog-shrouded town, the vanishing train tracks, figments of his imagination, a combination of exhaustion and exposure, case closed. But David knew better. The fear that lingered in his eyes, the nightmares that plagued his sleep, the unshakable feeling that he was being watched, these were not the remnants of a simple delusion. He knew, deep in his soul, that the station existed. It was real. And so was the darkness that resided within its heart. He pored over maps, studied old newspaper clippings, desperately searching for any mention of the town, the station, or the fate of his friends. But it was as if they had been erased from existence, leaving behind only a chilling silence and a void that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. Years passed. The world moved on. But David never forgot. The memory of that night haunted him, a chilling specter that refused to be laid to rest. He carried the weight of his experience like a phantom limb, the pain of his friend's disappearance a constant ache in his heart. He never spoke of what he had seen, knowing that no one would believe him. He became a recluse, his world shrinking to the confines of his small apartment, his only companions the fading photographs and newspaper clippings that served as grim reminders of his ordeal. The questions lingered, echoing in the silence of his lonely existence. What happened that night on the Midnight Express? Where did the train take them? Who were the figures in the fog? And what was the significance of the clock tower, its hands frozen at the stroke of midnight? He knew that the answers, if they existed at all, lay hidden somewhere in the darkness, shrouded in the mists of time and memory, and he vowed, with a quiet determination that burned brighter than fear, to one day find them. He owed it to Emily, he owed it to Richard, he owed it to himself.